What I was reading in some passages that talk about Abraham and Sarah, primarily Sarah, but we're also talking about Abraham just becoming involved Sarah, wife, and you know, the praying Colossians chapter 12, verse 30 of that, which is going to that, and some other text tonight, getting close to finishing this lesson. Meditation Friday is coming up to May, God's Sunday resting. You may like to teach the class, and probably be getting into the stuff for the next lesson. We'll make sure Terrace is not that ass to take it about it. That's the only thing about it. We'll take you to get that out and take it. It's what's the name? What's the name of that place? Gerar. Remember Gerar? So as we go through our text tonight, we'll be reading about some of those places. So we left off with verse 9 of Genesis chapter 12, and we talked about things up to that point. So in chapter 10 through verse 20, we see as Abraham goes on this journey, and I'm not going to read this text because we don't have as much time tonight, and I think some of this you're familiar with, and so we'll try to move a little bit. But what's the situation here in Genesis 12? You may want to just glance at it as you kind of read down through it as you open your Bibles here. But Abraham asked Sarah to do what? As they are on their travels, as they're traveling, whether it be Egypt and other places, he asked Sarah to do what? Okay, say that you're my sister. And later on in chapter 20, we have that reference as well. Another occasion, that's where he comes across Abimelech there at Gerar. Later on in chapter 20, the same thing happens again. But Abraham wants her to say that you're my sister. And in chapter 20, he reasons that, she really is my sister because what? Yeah, same father, half sister. But why did Abraham want her to say that you're my sister instead of my wife? Yeah, fear of being killed. And what was one of the reasons why Abraham feared to be killed because of Sarah? What was one of the reasons he gave? Yeah, she's a very beautiful woman. And when you read these texts, these others recognized her as being a very beautiful woman. But that's the context of what we find in chapter 12, verse 10 through verse 20. Also, we see a similar thing in chapter 20. And we asked the question, was what Abraham did a right thing to do? Was Abraham being deceitful? Yes. Is God okay with being deceitful? No. I'm not going to give these out. There's some proverbs that tell us about lying lips and deceit. Lying lips are an abomination to God, things like that. We can see throughout. This is something moral in one sense. This is something that's right and wrong, and God has never changed on whether He agrees with lying or deceit and so forth. So, if it wasn't the right thing to do, in fact, when you look at, I think that comes out even more when you look at the text in Genesis 20, because Abimelech is saying, basically is telling Abraham, you've done something to me that shouldn't have been done. But here's the question I wanted to get to. Sarah went along with Abraham's wishes even though he was being deceitful. And why would she do that? What is there anything we can learn about Sarah from this? The text is not going to tell us specifically why she did that, but what might be some reasons why she did that, why she went along.
Supposed to do in the sense of coming from Earth. That's the whole point of the story is God is telling him, you can't trust in the other nations like everyone else around you is doing. When you go into Egypt, you trust in Pharaoh. When you are in Babylon, you trust in the Chaldean king. When you're in Canaan, you trust in the Amorite king. But when you're in God's country, when you're following God, you follow God. And God is teaching them in this story that Pharaoh won't protect you, even if you lie and think you're going to get what you want. And you can see Sarah's growth in that, just as Abraham.
So are you saying that one of the reasons would have been that she maybe thought this was the right thing to do, or are you not saying that? Yeah.
She obviously thought it was going to protect her.
Yeah. Is it possible that Sarah thought this was the right thing to do? Is it possible that she didn't see anything wrong with it? Yes.
I think a lot of it was probably you didn't go against your husband. He told you to do something, it was just expected you did it.
That was one of the first reasons I wrote down, that submission to husband, and it may even carrying that thought to the point that whatever he would tell me to do, that's what I need to do. That could be part of it. Maybe she felt some pressure. Maybe she, like Abraham, maybe she had a fear of her life as well, and thought that that's what they needed to do. But it could have been some of those reasons. But I guess the bottom line that I would like for us to think about is that based on when we look at other passages, I think we can say that this is not anything that God would approve of as far as the lying and deceit. Does the fact that God, at least we don't have a record of God saying anything to them about this, does that mean that God accepted it? No. And whenever we think about Sarah, we'll get to that, if we don't run out of time, we'll get to that tonight. Whenever Sarah hears about this promise that she actually is going to have a child, God tells Abraham, Sarah's in the tent, Abraham laughs, Sarah's in the tent, she laughs, and God says, why did Sarah laugh? And Sarah denies it, I didn't laugh. Well, she lied, right? And lying is wrong, but we don't. It's not recorded that God punished her in any way. He might have. He might have given her talking. I don't know, but just the fact that nothing more is said about that particular detail doesn't mean that it's right. And the bottom line for all of that is, some people would use passages like this to preach situation ethics. It's okay to lie if I'm in a particular situation. And so I'm going to save my life or my wife's life or whatever it is. It's God's morals change based on the situation. That's what situation ethics would be. Thoughts or comments?
No matter what he did, he perfect. Her answer.
Yeah. And could Abraham have said, I know what God has promised. I got faith in God, and so God's going to protect me. You don't have to say you're my sister. God's going to protect me. Yeah, that would have been one way to have handled that without any lying or deceit.
We see some of the situation ethics also in Pharaoh and Abimelech, maybe more so in Abimelech in that story. He seems to be an upstanding guy, right? I mean, he doesn't sin against Sarah. God comes to him and tells him. He gives him these gifts and everything, and so he seems to be upstanding. But he also takes Sarah. I don't know what the customs would have been at that time, but Pharaoh took Sarah as well. But if they would have been truly upstanding, they would have not taking her at all.
Now, it seems like, just reading between the lines, it seems like their position was, as long as she's not taken by a man, married to a man, then I have a right to her. That's how I view both of those situations, and maybe that was their way of life. Okay, we're gonna keep moving. Genesis 13 and verse 1, just because it talks again. It's another reference that talks about Abraham going up from Egypt to the Negev, or the south country, and Sarah was with him. And we're not looking at chapter 14, because chapter 14 doesn't have a whole lot to do with Sarah. At least, I mean, she's still Abraham's wife. But in chapter 14, Abraham and Lot separate. There's a war between kings. Lot is taken, and Abraham rescues Lot. And so really wanted to pick back up with Sarah in chapter 15. And somebody read chapter 15, verse 1 through 7. Who'd like to read that? Okay, Mark, thank you. Genesis 15, 1 through 7.
After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed in the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. He said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess.
Okay, and then verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, etc. Did Abraham understand that God had made a promise which would be fulfilled through Abraham's seed? We first see that promise where? Genesis, a few chapters back, Genesis chapter 12. And so, what's the problem right now? Pardon? Well, yes, Sarah, but okay, because Sarah is barren, or you could say because the problem is Abraham doesn't have any children. Okay, I mean that's both of them together, yeah. So Abraham, that's how I was going to word it. Abraham doesn't have any children, and so Abraham recognizes God's promise, and since he doesn't have any children, and age-wise, whenever God first made the promise to Abraham, he was 75. And when you get to Genesis 16:16, Ishmael is born when Abraham is 86. And so whenever Ishmael is conceived, Abraham would be around 85. So if chapter 15:16, or I mean the same time frame, then Abraham is now around 85 years old. And so Sarah would be 75. And so Abraham's thinking, I'm at this age, here's God's promise. And how does Abraham solve this problem about who his seed's going to be? This Eliezer, right? Either one born in his house, or the word can just mean one who is a member of his household. I think that's how the English Standard Version reads it, is the second one. But Abraham understands God's promise, but he's older now. Sarah's older now. They haven't had any children, and so here's one that would perhaps fit that promise. But God tells him no, right? I mean, he's not the one. And so we're going to keep going. We get into chapter 16. We just talked about how old Abraham is when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. I spelled Ishmael wrong, but anyway. Get it on that big screen, you see all the mistakes. And so he was, whenever Ishmael was born, Abraham was 86. And so we're just kind of keeping his age in mind when we read some of these events here. So in chapter 16, Sarah is still barren. She doesn't have any children. And so how does she try to solve the problem of Abraham having seed? Hagar, take my handmaid Hagar. And that's what Abraham does. And so Hagar conceives, and Hagar has a child. Well, first of all, let's ask why did Sarah want Abraham to have a child with Hagar? I mean, why does she do this? Okay. Yeah, doesn't that tell us something about Sarah and understanding this promise? That would be part of it. Why else? Yeah.
Interesting that she hadn't done that before. That tells me that Abraham told her what the promise was.
Yeah, possibly. I want to get back to this. It was. How did people look down on? How do people look at? I just gave it away. How do people look at people who didn't have children? Kind of look down on them, right? I mean, there was maybe some shame involved in that, and so I would think Sarah is not only perhaps thinking about this promise, but also thinking about Abraham and wanting to do something for him. Maybe trying to help God in one sense, as far as carrying out this promise that God has made to Abraham. Other thoughts on that?
Then children were necessary economically. They raised your children to do the work. And it's interesting that Abraham was so wealthy and so successful, not having any children.
Yeah. Had prior to this point, up to this point, had God, as far as what we have recorded, had God specifically told Abraham that he was going to have seed by Sarah? I think you're right. The first reference I found of that is chapter 17. Whenever God specifically mentions in verse 16, I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. And the reason I mention that is because at this point in time, I would assume that Sarah knows about this promise, and also Abraham is childless, and I'm thinking that there's two good reasons why she would want Abraham and Hagar to get together, and part of that would be, as some have said, trying to help God in one sense fulfill that promise. So, as we continue in that story, what caused Sarah to despise Hagar? Whose attitude? Okay, what was? Huh? Okay, there is some laughing going on later on. Yeah, that's later on where Ishmael, there's laughing, and that's actually when Hagar gets put out for good. But right here in Genesis chapter 16,
She's jealous of the fact that Hagar, verse 4, that she got pregnant. She was just a head content. My verse is contempt.
so in verse 4, in verse 4, Sarah despises Hagar, right? He went into Hagar and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. Is it talking about Hagar, the mistress, being despised in Sarah's sight? That's how I took verse 4. Yeah. And who's looking at who with this? Well, in verse, I took verse 5 to mean that Sarah is despising Hagar, but then, verse 4, I mean, but then you get to verse 5, and I think this, if verse 4 is Sarah despising Hagar, I think verse 5 gives more information. Sarah said to Abram, may the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maiden to your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. If I understand it correctly, that Sarah saw that once Hagar had this child, Hagar was looking at her, despising her, and that caused Sarah to look upon Hagar with contempt. Thoughts or comments more on that?
Sarah, Hagar looked down on Sarah, but she won't have any children. I did.
Yep.
I think that right. In the Bible, it is funny. It's very clear that it's Hagar looking down before there.
Oh, in both verses? Verse 4 says, he went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. So I guess the question is who's the her in the last part?
The ESV says, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress.
Who's the mistress? Who's the mistress? What'd you say, Mark?
I think that Sarah was the mistress.
So if Sarah's the mistress, then both verses, like you're saying, would be saying the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the commentaries talks in terms of, at this point, it basically, Hagar felt herself being better than Sarah because she was able to conceive and Sarah wasn't, and, treating her inferiorly,
Yep.
as an inferior.
So what's the wrong done to Sarah? What wrong does Sarah think has been done to her in verse 5? Is it the fact that she has been despised by Hagar, or is it the fact that Hagar actually had a child with Abraham?
Well, that Abraham let Hagar have this kind of attitude. It's kind of
That was the purpose. The purpose.
like you let her turn on me. Now that she's pregnant, I gave her to you, and I was agreeable to that. I gave her to you. She got pregnant, and now she's looking at me as being this lowly individual. That's on you.
Yeah.
You shouldn't let her do that.
Whatever she's thinking, she's blaming Abraham, right? That's the purpose of that question. Why does Sarah blame Abraham for this? Charles is saying it may be the fact that Abraham let Hagar get away with having that kind of attitude toward Sarah. At least,
Because if you think in terms of discussing it, Sarah knew about the promise. Is it not far of a stretch to think that Hagar knew about the promise, and now all of a sudden, that puts her up on her high horse because now she's got what she thinks is the seed, the promise being fulfilled, and through her, not through Sarah.
well, that could be. If Sarah was putting blame on Abraham for the fact that Hagar had a child with him, whose fault would that be? I mean, that'd come back on Sarah, right? I mean, she's the one that suggested that. But at any rate, how does Abraham respond? Yeah, it's you do with her as you please. And I asked the question: was Sarah's treatment of Hagar wrong? I mean, was this something like it does say in verse 6 that she treated her harshly and she fled from her presence? I guess I was asking from the standpoint of being one of God's people, is something, did Sarah do something, did Sarah treat somebody here in a way that she shouldn't have treated them?
I don't think you should. I guess the situation's not going to happen today. But it does seem like that she's burned a bridge, I guess.
Yeah.
So she mistreated her.
Well, is that what your version says? Okay. It says she harshly treated her. And, I mean, I have viewed it as it's something she shouldn't have done. I could see somebody might reason that because Hagar despised her, there's consequences for what Hagar did. And that Abraham and Sarah would be the ones to, if you want to say, punish Hagar for the attitude that she had. Okay. Nothing to spend a whole lot of time on. I was just curious how people would answer that. Any other thoughts on that?
Corrected. That says something.
Well, it may just be, it may not be that he was correcting bad actions of Sarah. It may just be that he has a different plan for this situation. You know, I mean, that he steps in and says, no, here's what I want to happen here. So, anyway.
It just wasn't what was supposed to happen. I think both women were being not okay at the time.
Yeah, but as far as God's plan, you would, I mean, we would understand. I think that Abraham and Sarah understand this thing about the seed, or at least know there's some kind of seed coming for God's promise, but they wouldn't necessarily understand what God's plan is for Hagar and for Ishmael. But Ishmael was born in chapter 16. Chapter 17, Abraham. Oh, Kevin wants to know, was it wrong for Abraham to go into Hagar, to have Hagar? Couldn't we ask the same thing? Was it wrong for Jacob to have the handmaids? We know what God's original plan was, but we also know that God allowed some things. I think even Deuteronomy 4, when it talks about God permitted some things to protect a woman, as far as a husband's going to try to just put her away for whatever, and he's saying you need to think about that because I'm not going to let you get her back. But I think there's some things, I think, you know, like Acts talks about times of this ignorance God winked at. Anyway, there's things that God that wasn't what God originally intended, but he allowed things to happen without punishing right then and there. Anyway, thoughts? Has any bells rang yet? Okay. If I'm teaching in Dallas, or whoever wants to raise a finger, because I'm not hearing them evidently. But okay, the first bell. So we're just about out of time. Well, right. My ears are not as good as they used to be either. But right quick then, this last question. Whenever Sarah laughs that she's going to have a child, and then Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 11, says that Sarah had faith that was going to happen, that God's promise, I'm just paraphrasing, Sarah had faith that God's promise was actually, he's going to keep his promise. I mean, that's going to happen. Hebrews 11, verse 11, by faith even Sarah herself received ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. So how do we harmonize Sarah laughing when she hears about she's going to have a child, versus Hebrews that says that she knew God would keep his promise? I think so. The process of acceptance, and I think you see events that are happening that are going to produce faith in Sarah. I mean, it's not that Hebrews chapter 11 to me maybe is talking about a time frame like kind of like where we're at right now, where God is showing, through these bits and pieces that come up, God is showing that no, it's going to be through Sarah. And so I think it's easy to harmonize that at some point Sarah realizes that and has that faith. Thank you. All right. Any quick comments before we close? All righty. That's it.